Shalom, I'm Chris. Let's follow Jesus along the Talmidim way. Genesis 48, this is the blessing on Joseph's sons Ephraim and Manesseh, and something very interesting is happening throughout this chapter that I never really noticed before, but it really links all through the Old Testament, and it links into Jesus' ministry, and so we'll get to that at the end of the chapter. Acts 17:11 reminds us to trust but verify, receive the word with great eagerness, examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things are so. We are at the end of Jacob's life. He's 147 years old, coming to the close of the book, and Jacob is preparing for his death. In chapter 48 here, he's going to bless the sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manesseh, and then in chapter 49, he's going to bless the rest of the 12 tribes, or really pronounce prophecy over the 12 tribes, which is interesting. This is 17 years after Jacob and Joseph have been reunited. So again, Jacob's now 147, and we are in the land of Egypt, in the region of Goshen. Now it came about after these things that Joseph was told, "Behold, your father is sick." So he took his two sons, Manesseh, who was the chronological firstborn, and Ephraim, the secondborn, with him. When it was told to Joseph, "Behold, your son Joseph has come to you," Israel collected his strength and sat up in the bed. This is a minor point, but I think it's an important concept for disciples. You notice that these verbs are in the passive voice. Joseph was told, and then in verse 2, it was told to Jacob. It's a good reminder that every English translation is, in some sense, a paraphrase, meaning the editors needed to make decisions on how best to present the original Hebrew, or if it's New Testament Greek, present that to us in English in a way that makes sense. Hebrew does have a passive voice, but it's not used here. The word is actually the most common Hebrew verb in the Bible, vayomer, and it means, and he said. And so it literally says, in the Hebrew, it says, and he told Joseph, "Behold, your father is sick." So even in a literal translation like the NASB that we're using here, they elected to dodge this matter of who he is, because we have no idea who he is. So they just rendered it, Joseph was told, and it was told to Jacob. Now, this case, not a big deal at all. But in other cases, this is where you get into the big differences between the versions, the translations. So the NIV is going to be much more paraphrase. They're going to do it's called a thought for thought. They're going to try and get at what the thought of the underlying Hebrew or Greek was. NASB is usually quite literal. So the reason I bring this up is this kind of surprised me here, that they didn't render this as an active voice as it literally was. So again, just as Bereans, we need to realize that the English text we receive is filtered, and we just hope that it's filtered accurately. There's also another verse coming up. The last verse in this chapter is also going to have this editorial decision where some translators read it one way and others read it a different way. So he took his two sons, Manesseh and Ephraim, with him, and then we're going to find out that he's going to present these two boys to Jacob. And so it kind of a bit gets confusing. One way to look at this is that this verse 1 might be the overall thing that's going on, and then verse 2 might be the beginning of the story. So the story, if we were paraphrasing, might be, let me tell you about the time that Ephraim and Manesseh were blessed and adopted. And then verse 2, one day as the end of Jacob's days were near, Joseph went to his father, and so on and so forth. It's likely here that all of Jacob's sons were assembling outside the tent, really waiting to be called in for this deathbed blessing, which is a big deal in that culture. We need to remember Genesis 47, verse 28 through chapter 50, verse 2. They're all a single sequence. So this is all happening really in one pass, and we need not to get thrown off by the chapter breaks. Then Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty, El Shaddai, has appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said to me, Behold, I will make you fruitful and numerous. I will make you a multitude of peoples, and I will give this land to your descendants after you as an everlasting possession." Speaking of editorializing, that's kind of what Jacob is doing here. He's taking really three different episodes and telling it as one story. So in Genesis 28, we have God speaking to Jacob. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth. You will spread out to the west and to the east and north and south. And in you and your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. And then in chapter 35, he says, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A multitude of nations shall come from you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you. And then back in chapter 28, verse 3, we have Isaac blessing Jacob. May God Almighty bless you and make you fruitful and multiply you so that you may become a multitude of people. So the threefold promises, two from God and one from Isaac, are being kind of wrapped up in Jacob's verse here. Verse 5, now your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt are mine. Ephraim and Manesseh shall be mine. So he's listing Ephraim first here. Just as Reuben, the chronologic firstborn, and Simeon are mine. But your children that you have fathered after them shall be yours. They shall be called by the names of their brothers in their inheritance. So verse 6, he's really saying this is a one-time special. We're going to adopt Ephraim and Manesseh, and they're going to be regarded as my own children, but everything after that is all yours. So as Jacob's days were nearing an end, Joseph may have been wondering, Joseph knows that Jacob's views him as his favorite. And so Joseph may have been wondering, how are we going to work this with all these other brothers going on? Is Jacob merely going to cut the other brothers out of the will, basically, just as Abraham did with Esau? And if so, that would seem to start the entire mess all over again. Jacob would just paint a big fat target on Joseph in the eyes of his brothers, just like when he gave him the special coat that made the brothers jealous. Jacob, however, now is much more wiser, and he has something else in mind. He still wants Joseph to be the firstborn, but what he's going to do is he's going to formally adopt Ephraim and Manesseh as his own, and he's going to give them a prioritized ranking with their inheritance. So Reuben and Simeon were the chronologic first and second born, but he's really bumping Ephraim and Manesseh to the front of the line here. And we'll kind of see how this plays out as we work through the rest of this chapter. Now, as for me, when I came from Padan, that's Padan Aram, up in Mesopotamia, from the property of Laban, Rachel died to my sorrow in the land of Canaan on the journey, when there was still some distance to go to Ephrath. I buried her there on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. So from this we learn that Jacob has never recovered from Rachel's death. Rachel was the only woman Jacob ever intended to marry. Had this happened the way Jacob wanted, then Joseph indeed would have been his firstborn son. But we know history intervened and Laban intervened, so he married Leah instead, and Leah's children were born first. Despite all that, Jacob was always viewing Joseph as his firstborn son. And even though Reuben, Simeon, and Levi forfeited their firstborn inheritance by various acts of indiscretion, Judah, as well as a long line of other sons, were in that firstborn line way ahead of Joseph. But what Jacob is doing is he's working around this. And kind of like our government prints more money and the problem goes away, Jacob prints more sons. He now has 13 sons. We don't count Joseph if we count Ephraim and Manesseh. So we go from 12 to 13. And what this does is he's giving Joseph a double portion and kind of devaluing everyone else's share in the process. It's very complicated, but in Chronicles, we get this hint of what is going on here. 1 Chronicles 5, the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, and we're going to start listing the sons, but first, there's this parentheses. For he was the firstborn, but he defiled his father's bed. So his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the son of Israel. So he is not enrolled in the genealogy according to his birthright. Though Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came the leader, the birthright belonged to Joseph. So rather than run afoul of any procedures, he basically says, I'm going to adopt Ephraim and Manesseh, and through them, Joseph is going to get a double portion that way. So pretty clever move by Jacob. Now Judah is still going to be honored. If we look at the size of his land grant, fast forward to the time of Joshua, we're going to see that was roughly equal, and perhaps a little bit more than Ephraim and Manasseh's land grant combined. So Judah still gets the bigger share of all of the 12 tribes. We're going to study that blessing that he receives and hit Judah along with the rest of the 12 tribes next time. When Israel saw Joseph's sons, he said, "Who are these?" And Joseph said to his father, "These are my sons, whom God has given me here." So he said to them, "Bring them here, please, so that I may bless them." Now the eyes of Israel were dim from age that he could not see. Joseph brought them close to him, and he kissed them, and he embraced him. You have to see the parallel and kind of the humor in this identical scene back in Genesis 27, when Isaac's eyes were dim, and he also asked, "Who are you, my son?" He wasn't fully convinced that the person representing himself as Esau was in fact Esau. So we see this pattern of blessing throughout all the patriarchs, right? The second is blessed over the first, and it's going to be repeated here, but this time there's no concealed identity. Everything is out in the open, and everything is intentional. Ephraim and Manesseh were probably quite younger. They were in their 20s. They looked like Egyptians because they were Egyptians. They didn't look like Hebrews. So if I want to give Jacob some grace here, it's probably because they didn't look at all like he might have expected them to look. Along with his dim eyes, that might have explained why Jacob needed to verify their identity. And Israel said to Joseph, "I never expected to see your face, and behold, God has let me see your children as well." Then Joseph took them from his knees and bowed with his face to the ground. Another element of Hebrew wordplay here. The word for knees has the same root letters as the word to bless. And the word for bless is bracha. And you can hear the B and the R and the CH. I've got those highlighted in red on your screen there. So maybe a lesson or connection. Is there a blessing for us when we are on our knees? And yes, I think there is. This is probably a tad awkward for Joseph because his sons are now legally his brothers. May have been a little weird for him, but so it went in the ancient world. Joseph took them both, Ephraim with his right hand towards Israel's left, and Manesseh with his left hand towards Israel's right. So he's positioning them in the proper order of birth order. So Manesseh is on Jacob's right hand, and Ephraim is on his left for the second position. But Israel reached out his hand and placed it on the head of Ephraim, his right hand, who was the younger, and in his left hand on Manasseh's head, crossing his hands, although Manesseh was the firstborn. So you can picture the scene where Jacob is in bed and he's mustering up all the strength he can to cross his arms here. So the adoption procedure we talked about is important because now Jacob can bestow blessings on Ephraim and Manesseh with the same authority that he blesses his own sons. So here we again continue the theme of the younger son receiving the privileged treatment. In Hebrews 11, it says, "By faith, Jacob, as he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff." And you might be wondering, okay, I thought he was in bed. Where did the staff come from? It's another Hebrew wordplay that throughout this chapter. Bed in Hebrew is the word mitah, and the word for staff is mateh. And Hebrew was written without vowels, so these two words are exactly the same. We have some wordplay going on here. A staff is going to be a factor, the staff of Judah in chapter 49. And if we think back to chapter 38, what did we have? We had Tamar presenting herself as a prostitute. For surety, she asked for Jacob's ring, cord, and staff, mateh. The word's different in Hebrew, but it's his staff. And that they also went into the bed. And so there's the definite wordplay happening here. This blessing, very poetic, the arrangement here. And he blessed Joseph and said, "The God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the boys, and may my name live on in them, and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." So angels, remember in the Jacob's ladder, the dream that he had that bridged from this world to the next world, and now as he's on the verge of exiting this world and maybe thinking about the world to come, he's recalling and referencing this dream. He's referred to God earlier as El Shaddai, the protector, the guardian, and he sees this angel as symbolizing God's enduring protection over Jacob, who by all accounts probably should not have lived this long. He made enemies quite easily, and any one of those, had God not protected him, Jacob could have had a very different end. When Joseph saw that his father placed his right hand on Ephraim's head, it displeased him, and he grasped his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's. And so he doesn't want to inappropriately correct his father, but he knows that these deathbed blessings are irrevocable. And so he says, "Are you sure about this?" Joseph says, "Not so, my father, for this one is the firstborn. Place your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He will also become a people, and he will be great. However, his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations." We can see that the lines here between blessing and prophecy get blurred. When we think of a blessing, we say, "May it go well for you." But a prophecy would say, "It is going to go well for you." And so Jacob knows that it's going, these two boys are going to be tremendous in terms of national status. So unlike Isaac, who mistakenly blesses Jacob, Jacob intentionally blesses Ephraim. So he blessed them that day, saying, "By you Israel will pronounce blessing, saying, may God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." Very interesting blessing there. And so he put Ephraim before Manasseh. Then Israel said to Joseph, "Behold, I'm about to die, and God will be with you. Bring you back to the land of your fathers." Not in this life, but after you die, your bones are going to be taken back to the promised land. "And I give you one portion more than your brothers, which I took from the hand of the Amorite, my sword with my bow." So we'll come back to verse 22. Very interesting translation decision that was made there. First, verse 20, "May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." This verse is spoken every Shabbat evening when a Jewish father blesses his sons. And he says, "May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." Now, in my opinion, the daughters get the better end of the deal because it says, "May God make you like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah." And so we might want to ask, why do the boys get Ephraim and Manasseh? Why doesn't it say, why aren't you blessed like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? And the thought here is that the blessing that they want is the same that Jacob spoke over the boys. Not that we want our boys to be like Ephraim and Manasseh, and we might say, God forbid to that, they made their share of mistakes. But we want them to be blessed with the same blessing that they received from Jacob. So that might make more sense. But in any case, Lancaster says, don't wait until you're on your deathbed before you bless your children. And that is a very good thought as we wrap this chapter up. All right, this one portion, I give you one portion more than your brothers. Again, more Hebrew wordplay. In Hebrew, the phrase is Shechem Echad, and that can literally mean one portion. And again, he gets one portion more than his brothers because it's a double portion because of the adoption ceremony that we've just gone through. However, you may have heard a town name in there, Shechem. Jewish translators often render this as, "I give you first Shechem above your brothers." So, and as I read this, I see the one portion with all that we've gone through with Ephraim and Manasseh and Joseph as the firstborn. But I think when you look at the importance of what is happening here in verse 22 in the book of Joshua and indeed in the Gospel of John, I think we should have rendered this Shechem. And let me show you why. Let's fast forward to New Testament times. This is a map of Jesus's early ministry, and he's going to come to a town called in Samaria called Sychar. Sychar is basically a twin city of the town of Shechem. He had to pass through Samaria, so he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the parcel of land that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. So note the connectivity in the geography here. It's really like bookends. So let's go back to Genesis. Remember when Joseph went to search for his brothers, where did he go? He first went to Shechem. He didn't find them there, and so he went up to the town you see on the north of that called Dothan. And that's where all the trouble started. It came to a head. Dothan is where he was thrown into a pit, and basically all this started. And it's just this case of sibling rivalry. Now, many years later, Joseph decided to end that sibling rivalry with his immediate brothers. He says, I forgive you, and we're going to see this beautiful restoration in chapter 50. However, centuries later, the Jews and the Samaritans are still basically continuing the sibling rivalry with Ephraim and Manasseh. The remnants of those tribes become the Samaritans, and then the Jews are remnants of Judah. And in fact, this Samaritan woman picks up on this. She says, "You are not greater than our father Jacob, are you?" And this is important. "Who gave us this well and drank of it himself," right? He gave us the well, his sons and his cattle. So she's drawing back to this time when Jacob bought Samaria, claimed Samaria, and the Samaritans would see this as part of their inheritance. In verse 20, "Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and yet you Jews say in Jerusalem is the place where one must worship." Jesus said to her, "Believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." So Jesus, again, no more sibling rivalry. We're done with this. "You Samaritans worship what you don't know. We worship what we do know, because salvation is from the Jews." And we have this beautiful picture of the Samaritan woman being restored to faith, and the 5 husbands and all that. And then she goes into town, and the men of the town convert. And they're very excited about what is happening here. And so Jesus, again, is bridging the same gap that Joseph bridged between his natural-born brothers. Jesus is also bridging that between the Samaritans and the Jews. Now, if we go back in time a little bit to the time of Joshua, Joseph is later going to be buried in Shechem. At the end of the book of Joshua in chapter 24, they buried the bones of Joseph. So remember, Jacob prophesied that you will be back in the promised land, just not when you're alive, when the sons of Israel were brought up from Egypt at Shechem. In the plot of land Jacob had bought from the sons of Hamor, the father of Shechem, for 100 pieces of money. They became the inheritance for Joseph's son. So this whole land is really the tribe of Ephraim. And of course, Joshua is from the tribe of Ephraim as well. So Shechem is a very important city that a lot of people don't know about. We did a geographic background video on this, and I'll put that in the comments section. But Shechem is also where the covenant is renewed. In verse 1 of chapter 24, Joshua gathered all the tribes of Israel at Shechem and called for the elders of Israel, their heads, their judges, their officers, and they presented themselves before God. So all of this tying back to this little verse in chapter 48, verse 22. And it turns out to be quite pivotal that Jacob is now giving Shechem to Joseph, and it carries on from there. So pretty important, has implications in Joshua and in the time of the kings. There's going to be this division between Ephraim and Manesseh, and basically Judah in the south, and then Jesus bridges all that in John chapter 4. So it all kind of knits together very nicely, but again, important to recognize some of the translation issues that we encounter. So next time we'll look at the blessing over the 12 tribes in Genesis 49. So we're going to see you then.